Okay, good evening, folks. The meeting, we have quorum, so the meeting will now be called to order. Rachel, will you complete the roll call, please?
Elborus. Present. Brongan.
Here.
Brown.
Here.
Finley. Garcia Sierra.
Here.
Hunt is excused. Jorgensen. Here. Ketchum. Here. Figueroa. Pekoshik is excused. Saiz is excused. Bang. Here. Udisi.
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, again, we'd like to thank you all for being here this evening. And we really much appreciate you being here to share this moment with us. So with that being said, our next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. Committee members, are there any questions with the prior minutes? Jerry?
I will make that correction. Absolutely.
Yeah, we noticed that. Okay. If there are no further questions, committee members, those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Abstain? All right, minutes approved. So we have quite a few public speakers tonight, comment speakers tonight. So what we would ask is that everyone is mindful of the time limit. You will be given 3 minutes to speak, and we look forward to all of your comments. You're welcome. So with that being said, we're going to get started right away, and we will start off with Anna Moffett. Please come up to the table.
Hi there. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. For those who don't know me, I'm a former Madison Board of Education member and chairperson of the Educational Resource Officer Ad Hoc Committee. I'm just here to speak on behalf of supporting the recommendations that have been put forth by OIR. There's value in a lot of them. I also want to speak to some of the discussion around transforming the use of police in our schools. The ERO Ad Hoc has been meeting for about a year and a half, and through the discussions and looking at models from across the country and looking at our own district data, as well as the new expectations that are being placed on us by the state government, the majority of the members feel like rather than positioning officers directly in our schools, that we should be looking at a different model that would be more effective for covering our whole school district. We have many different schools. And so we have had some discussion around looking at modeling it after the mental health, I believe, crisis team unit, where you have a group of individuals that are knowledgeable that could be interacting with the school, and even moving towards something where there may be like a police liaison officer that would interface with the MPD. We're also, many of us are in favor of expanding restorative practices within the schools, as well as making sure that we have an increase in social workers and other people to provide some of those supports that currently some of the EROs are providing in our schools. I would also encourage this committee to be open to comments and discussions from the folks that attend, whether that needs to occur via vote by this committee or other means. Madison is a community that has a tremendous wealth of expertise, and I know sometimes folks get selected for these things, but other times people aren't selected who actually have valuable insight into the conversation. So I would just like to say that, and in conclusion, I'd also like to invite you all to our final meeting of the ERO Ad Hoc Committee. It will be next Thursday at the Doyle Building. It will be starting at 4:30 p.m., and we'll be meeting in the large assembly hall to accommodate folks that attend and give public comment at these meetings, and you'll be able to learn more about what the final proposal will be that will be moving to the full Board of Education. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker will be, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, is it Maya Tayo Yang? Come forth, come forth.
Hi, my name is Maital and I'm a youth organizer at Freedom Inc. I am here to tell you all to get rid of this contract between the MMSD and the MPD. I recently graduated from West High School, and to what I see, police are in our schools don't do shit. There have been times when I asked police officers in my school for help, but they did nothing. Yet when it's time to criminalize some kids of color, they're the first one on the scene. To me, it feels useless to have police in our schools. If this is what they do, they are supposed to be there for educational purposes because they are supposed to be educational resource officers, but why is that when I ask for help, nothing happened? My voice is not even heard because it goes in one ear and out the other. It's not even this too, but harassing students of colors, especially black students, this is what you call educational? From the police to us, this is not what you call educational. Police in our schools is not even helping our people, but instead leading our people, aka people of color, into school to prison pipeline. We demand, 1, to end the contract between the MMSD and the MPD, meaning we don't want police to be involved in any school activities or even on school grounds. Second, invest money into youth of color, supporting the $360,000 into youth of color, giving them supplies such like bus passes that they can't afford, better lunches, not just better lunch, but free reduced lunch to the people who can't afford lunch. Also hire youth advocates to work with students of color in a cultural specific way. Last but not least, parents and students should have community control over discipline, meaning students and parents get a chance to decide what they want to learn in schools. Lastly, no cops in schools.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Shira Adams.
My name is Shira, and I'm a youth staff at Freedom Inc. This is the first time we are coming here, but this is not the first time that you've heard of us. We have a campaign called No Cops in Schools, and trying to get the $360,000 invested into youth of color and not cops. There's really no point of them being there. It would never make black kids feel comfortable. If you all could open up your ears and listen to us, we have 3 demands. The first one is take cops out of schools. The second one is invest the money into youth of color and not cops. And the third one is to give parents, youth, and community control over school discipline. We want kids, especially kids of color, to feel safe and not like jail. Kids can't develop with officers that kill first and ask questions after. We need more cultural specific counselors in schools, free bus passes, and better books and food. This is what the $360,000 could go into instead of EROs. I really hope you all hear our voices and not ignore us like the Ad Hoc Committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Savon.
Good evening. Thank you for having us here. I know this is the first time that I'm here to speak. So I just want to tell a little bit about myself. I am a first generation here from Cambodia as a refugee. My family escaped from Cambodia to a refugee Thailand camp to come to this country because at first, I thought, wow, America is great. A land of freedom, a land of opportunity, right? But then the more I learned the truth of my history, about my background, they didn't teach me this in school. I have to learn it from my people. I have to learn it through the grassroots organization like Freedom Inc. The more I understand about my history, the more it makes me feel like I need to reclaim what is right for me. So what I'm saying is that the US went and bombed Cambodia. There's more bomb dropped in Cambodia than Hiroshima, and that is very disgraceful. Today, my people still struggle. Till this day, the trauma that was built within them. I have my youth here with me, my Lotus youth. They're here to see what it means to fight for what is right, fight for human right. And you know what? I feel like all my life, because of my skin colors, policing has been very hard. I am scared when I see police officer because of the trauma that I faced when I was younger. So what I'm asking is that why not take cops out of school, allow kids to be kids? Who hasn't been in trouble growing up? Who hasn't been making mistakes? These are lessons that we learn throughout our lives. This is experience that we learn. I bet some of you steal things, right? We all done wrong, and this is what it's mean to grow up as a teenager. We all have steps, a milestone that we go through, whether it's from babies to childhood and then to adulthood to, an elderly. Those are life experience that we experience. Why not let kids experience those things in a way that is more appropriate for them, not having to call a police officer coming into school and harass kids, especially those are Black and brown students. So I know that you are part of the committee as a big whole committee as the City of Madison. So I'm asking you to consider. So yes, that's about it. Thank you for your work.
Thank you. Bianca Gomez.
So hi, my name is Bianca Gomez. I'm a youth staff. Well, I'm a grown-up, but I work with the youth. And I just want to say, well, not a few things, things that I carefully calculated for y'all to hear. But so having police in schools does not actually protect our kids. It doesn't make them feel safe. It doesn't protect them from school shootings. It doesn't protect them from people who are unauthorized to come into the building or whatever their excuses have been. It doesn't do anything to improve behavior or discipline, and then does not increase their capacity to learn. So those all have been justifications for having police in schools, but we know from scientific research and academic data and all these things that that's actually untrue. But on the other hand, having police in school does criminalize kids, it does traumatize kids, and it does force them to navigate anti-Black, anti-POC, anti-girl, anti-queer spaces. And every justification for having police in school has, again, been disproved and discredited by research. And the reality is most folks won't publicly admit why they want police in schools because they don't want to be called out for anti-Black racism or whatever. But the reality is people in this city in particular want police in schools because they think that Black children are thugs and criminals, and they want to protect white kids from them. And I think that's really important to call out. And I don't think people on this committee are blind to the statistics in the city of Madison about racial disparities. And I also don't think people on this committee are blind to all of the stuff that's been happening in the country, like Black people getting the police called on them for literally just existing, right? And that's what's led to so many Black deaths in this country. That's what led to Tony Robinson's death. That's what led to the beating of Janelle Laird at Easttown Mall. And we don't want those people around our children. We don't think that those people keep our children safe. We want healthy alternatives and accountability for our kids that we tell you they need, that the kids tell you they need, not some people sitting in a high box tell you that they need. And again, it's like data proven and common sense that giving kids the resources that they need to be healthy students, giving them the resources that they need to survive will give us the outcomes that we want for our kids. And police don't do that. They make our children feel unsafe. They make our children feel traumatized. They lead our children into prisons, which if if Madison is an example of that, then I don't know what is. So again, I encourage you to make the recommendation to remove the police from schools and invest that money into our kids instead of spending it on people that are continuously harming our kids.
Thank you. Rika? Oh, I'm sorry, Erica?
Hey, my name is Erica, and I'm a youth leader at Freedom Inc. I'm here today to talk about why I don't want cops in school. Us Black kids are sick and tired of getting hurt by those cops in school. They have no reason to be locking us up or beating us over simple school issues. I'm pretty sure when they were kids, they made mistakes, but we all get punished for simple stuff. White kids are allowed to be kids, but we are not. We are seen as criminals. For once, put yourself in our shoes of Black students. My sister friend got dragged on the floor by a cop for talking in class. We're really tired of this stuff. Kids can't even be kids no more. We can't even enjoy our childhood in school without a cop being called because the teachers think we're doing something wrong. We demand you take cops out of school, invest money into youth of color, and give community control over discipline. Thank you.
Thank you. Monka?
Yeah. So, y'all. So my name is Monka. I work over at Freedom Inc. I'm the Community Power Building Coordinator. And what that means is that I pretty much take care of all things civic engagement wise. And my main goal is to work with people in our community. We're based on the South Side. I live on the South Side on Park Street. We want to work with people so that we can have conscious voters at the polls, right? Whether that means the generals coming up, school board elections, whatever, right? That they're conscious, that they're thinking about social justice when they go in the ballot box. And a lot of times I get so wrapped up in our various, whether it's a reproductive health or social justice issues, that I don't even think about how other people in the community are perceiving these issues, right? Until we go knocking and our script goes something like, hey, so I work at Freedom Inc., we do direct services. We also care about social justice, and one of our reproductive issues is no cops in schools. Do you support taking the cops out of the schools, investing that money in children of color, and then supporting community control over discipline? And the biggest answer isn't, oh my God, yeah, keep the cops, or no, don't keep the cops. It's what? There's cops in our schools? How did we get here?
I mean, at least me growing up on the south side of Chicago, I know when I see the police, I run. It's not, I'm gonna go walk up to them. I've never been in trouble in my life, and I still know that. From their conception, they were made to catch us and make sure that we wouldn't uprise during slavery, right? So how did they get into our schools? Their function has never changed. It doesn't matter how much training that you get, how many psychology degrees you get as a police officer, you have the right to kill someone at your discretion because they're not acting right, or you don't think that they're acting right. And that's all your discretion. All of your personal biases, all the systematic racism goes into that, and it affects our black students more than it does the white ones that are actually getting protected, right? Cops usually, I mean, by the time cops get there, the fight is over, right? Somebody done got their ass beat already. But there's gonna be 2 other people or 3 other people that are maybe just standing there that's also gonna get their ass dragged and beat, right? By that police officer trying to break up the fight. When a shooting happens, the police don't stop them, they get there afterwards. Or they go hide somewhere, right? Which is your right as a person, you can do that. But I'm saying, how do we get to this point? Right? Think about that. They're no good for at least people that look like me. And if we say in Madison that we care about racial disparities, like I hear y'all saying all the time, do take actual steps to put it into them, because they're not disparities, they're like that on purpose. Remove cops from schools. It doesn't matter how they're there, you don't have any control over them while they're in there, so it doesn't matter about all the recommendations that you have for them about how they should act. So like I said, remove them from schools, spend that money on how many thousands of bus passes, better food, so that people are actually awake and not cranky when they're in class and getting into trouble and stuff like that.
Thank you. Jackson Willis. Kai Van wishes not to speak this evening. Nathan? Nathan?
So I have a handout, if you guys wouldn't mind just passing this around. So hey everybody, I'm Nate Royko-Maurer. First, let me thank you for your diligent efforts. You've been at this for a really long time, and I deeply appreciate how much energy you've brought to this. I apologize for not being present more often myself. I just want to remind you of the community-centric language in the Common Council's original charge to you. The language went something like, whereas the City of Madison understands a community should participate in defining how it wants to be policed, and the community then has an obligation to review culture, practices, and procedures, and then has an obligation to support the police department in fulfilling its responsibility. Whereas the City of Madison is committed to involving the community in advising and making recommendations to the mayor, the Common Council, the Police and Fire Commission, and the Madison Police Chief on matters of setting policies and procedures that reflect our city's longstanding tradition of community policing. So I'm emphasizing that the community-centric language is there, and I've seen practice lately that suggests maybe that's drifting. In light of this, it was really disappointing to see how the city attorney's office and the city staff were attempting to limit public participation through unsupportable interpretations of Robert's rules and citations of non-existent city policy. Apparently, they seem to be hoping that the community won't show up to these meetings so they can push a particular agenda more easily. When dedicated community members do show up consistently to provide input, they're accused of being disruptive. No one on the city staff, though, accuses the Madison Police Department of being too involved, giving them the benefit of the doubt that their participation in this community-led process is motivated entirely by good faith. They clearly have a great deal of influence, with wide deference given to their desires when an OIR recommendation is presented that they would rather not have to follow. I see compromise after compromise with significant recommendations being watered down with too vague language. Please remember that you are making your best, strongest recommendations and that it is up to the council to haggle it out with the police department. Finally, I want to leave you with something that really disturbed me when I discovered it. Please take a look at the handout that I just provided. After reading the 2018 MPD current status and plan for 21st century policing, I had to ask myself, is MPD hard trolling us? Did the department actually choose to use a photo of police officer Matt Kenny to represent the chapter Pillar 1, Building Trust and Legitimacy? Would they really use the officer that killed Tony Robinson, that sparked months of protest in the city, that caused untold trauma for a family and a community, that was the very impetus for the formation of this committee to back up the assertion that people are more likely to obey the law when they believe that those who are enforcing it have the legitimate authority to tell them what to do? The public confers legitimacy only on those they believe are acting in procedurally just ways. Of all the mounted officers they might have chosen, did MPD really choose this notorious one to represent building trust and legitimacy? I actually kind of doubted it. But when I made an open records request and asked Lieutenant John Radovan if he could confirm my suspicions, he wrote back, "Nathan, thanks for bringing this to my attention. It is likely Officer Matt Kenny in that photo. The same photo was on page 15 of the document. It's not clear he is pictured anywhere else in that same report. I brought this to Chief Koval's attention, and he directed that those photos be changed, which they now have been." If this was intentional, can I have another minute? If this was intentional, then why would they decide to change it? Do they see how wrong this is? Were they hoping no one would notice? Was this a dog whistle? For the record, I never asked them to change the photo. If it was unintentional, then how can we trust the department's ability to gauge how well it is doing building this supposedly crucial trust when this act alone displays a phenomenal degree of insensitivity? It's not the only one to have occurred with this particular officer. I bring this to your attention so that you remember that it must be the community driving change here, not the police, not city staff, and for good reason. Please stay the course, seek input from engaged community members, talk to experts outside the department, and do not be intimidated by those in the city administration or the police department who would seek to have you act otherwise. Also, listen to the youth, no cops in schools.
Thank you. Dr. G.
Hello. This past Tuesday, the Common Council Executive Committee discussed the MPD Policy and Procedure Review Ad Hoc Committee, including procedures for public input. It was agenda item 15 of the CCEC meeting, and Keith Findley participated by phone as Ad Hoc Committee co-chair. Alders advocated that the Ad Hoc Committee suspend the rules to allow members of the public to participate in discussions, as other city committees have done. This was done, for example, by the President's Work Group, which dealt with police reform, and the current Surveillance Equipment Committee. I'll note that in a discussion after the last Ad Hoc Committee meeting, Jerry Vang had also brought up the option of suspending the rules to allow full public participation. Alder Rebecca Kemble referenced the original Common Council resolution setting up the Ad Hoc Committee and read from the charter the Council gave to the committee. She noted how the charter emphasized the importance of community input. As Nate said, whereas the City of Madison understands the community should participate in defining how it wants to be policed, and the community then has an obligation to review culture, practices, and procedures, and then has the obligation to support the police department in fulfilling its responsibilities, and whereas the City of Madison is committed to involving the community in advising and making recommendations to the mayor, the Common Council of Police and the Fire Commission and the Madison Police Chief in matters of setting policy and procedures that reflect our city's longstanding tradition of community policing, etc. She and other alders noted that arranging to maximize opportunity for community input in the work of the committee was part of the core mission of the committee. That was the council's intent in setting it up. I sometimes hear people talk about a lack of citizen participation in city governance, but why would anyone expect participation when some city staff seek to rig process to suppress meaningful input? At the last MPD Ad Hoc Committee, a staff member interrupted the meeting, claiming, quote, point of order, end quote, then said she wanted counsel from the assistant city attorney who was attending. Clearly, this was prearranged since the assistant city attorney had an answer, even though no explicit question had been asked of her. The assistant city attorney stated that the deliberation period of the committee was, quote, for discussion among staff, end quote. She further said that the committee members can ask staff questions during their discussion, but are prohibited from asking questions of members of the public, and that if a committee member had any kind of whispered side conversation with a committee member, that's also a violation of procedure. The procedural constraints with these staff members sought to impose create an extreme imbalance in information flow to committee members, which undermines capacity for optimal decision-making. By preventing committee members from hearing countervailing information during discussion, staff can de facto control outcome. During the 3-minute public comment period, there's no way to know exactly where the committee discussions will lead, exactly which OIR recommendations will be discussed, and what information needs to be conveyed. Meanwhile, during discussion, staff can talk and argue endlessly with no time constraints, able to speak to whatever points get raised in the discussion. I asked professional registered parliamentarians about these claims by the Assistant City Attorney, and they were unanimous in their criticisms of the claims. The claims appear to have no support either in published City of Madison procedural rules or in Robert's Rules of Order. Can I have one more minute?
Yes, sir.
Which is supposed to govern when no specific stated city rule does. 1, the staff person was not a committee member and actually had no right to speak, and what they said was not a point of order, and they had no right to ask a question of the Assistant City Attorney. What's funny is they're breaking the rules the committee is supposed to operate under, while falsely claiming, in order to prevent potential input from me, that I and committee members were breaking rules. In addition, the assertion by the Assistant City Attorney that the committee discussion time was, quote, for discussion among staff, end quote, is entirely contrary to Robert's Rules of Order, since staff as non-members have no right to speak unless asked a question, although I've repeatedly seen the Assistant City Attorney ignore that restriction. 2, as far as I can tell, under the procedural rules governing the committee, committee members have every right to ask community members such as me questions during the discussion. And I've seen this happen relatively frequently during other city committee meetings, and I've even seen it occasionally happen during Common Council meetings. Parliamentarians tell me the only time it's a problem is if a committee member objects, then a vote can be taken to allow it. And I'll point out that no committee member objected. At the end of the prior meeting, several committee members actually had thanked me for providing information that answered questions during discussion. There's nothing in the procedural rules that will prohibit a whispered side conversation between committee members and a community member. This happens all the time in city committee meetings. I've seen it in PSRC meetings, ALRC meetings, Plan Commission meetings, etc. Finally, the committee can suspend the rules to allow members of the public to participate in discussion. The Assistant City Attorney could have informed the ad hoc committee of this option, but apparently chose not to. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Doc. Amelia?
This is intentional. There's no doubt about that. This is intentional. Whoever put this photograph on here, it's as intentional as every time they send Matt Kenny into the neighborhoods of children who are afraid of police, and especially police who killed Tony Robinson. It's intentional. And Chief Koval says, we didn't notice, we're sorry, it's an oversight. It's intentional. It's an underhanded way of saying we can shove him down your throat if we want to. We exonerated him. Deal with it. I am so grateful this group exists. I thank you so much for how serious you've taken this endeavor. I've never seen anything while I've been living in Madison happen like this, where a group of members of the public have come together and just continue to meet and see this through in the way that you have. I am concerned about what appear to me to be the obvious emotional attachments demonstrated by contributions of current and former police officers working within this group. I hope that it does not cloud this process, and I urge you to protect this process from it. As for the 24 to 48 hour rule, in my own experience being interviewed in the hours following my friend Polly's death, my mind was clear as a bell, and I was motivated by wanting what felt like a puzzle sorted out in those first few hours. I wanted to know what happened. That's what mattered most to me. And that's all that mattered to his parents wanted to know what happened. His friends wanted to know it. We wanted to know what happened, and any contribution we could make to find out what happened, we were willing to make. So this idea that people might not come back, perhaps that's a reason to not give civilians also 24 to 48 hours. It's kind of a weak excuse. I think the bigger reason why Chief Wall mentioned that they don't want civilians to be able to do that is perhaps, like Chief Koval, those witnesses and their attorneys might do some damage control PR and get on the news and start making statements before the criminal investigation's finished. Or perhaps they may watch the news and get their story straight so they aren't liable. Or perhaps, they'll just talk to people, or maybe they'll collude with their friends. The only thing that Chief Wall is afraid of is what his officers can already do. they can already collude and get together and get their story straight. And I have to say specifically, can I talk specifically to members of this group, or is that forbidden? Can I speak directly to anybody here?
Well, you're speaking directly to all of us.
Okay, so I have to talk about the statement that OIR found no indication of the investigation process for these critical incidents. There was no indication that they'd been conducted inappropriately or that officers were lying. That troubled me because I'm guessing that every single person on this committee was brought on board to contribute with 100% honesty and integrity, and to contribute what they know to be true for the purpose of producing the best possible result, may I have more time, for this city, and I don't believe you are sharing what you know to be true. It was stated that the investigative process is working well, and I'm willing to bet that officers said that in 2012. When Officer Heimsness was, after killing Polly, and during the criminal investigation, allowed to drive himself back to the station alone, wearing forensic evidence. I'm guessing that when he was harassing people within the department and the department failed to investigate him, that everybody thought everything was going just fine when they were talking outside the department. It wasn't. And still, nobody has said anything since that officer who spoke up about the harassment and was forced out and denied duty disability and spoke up for the other people who were harassed were by and large people of color. They were harassed by Heimsness, and nobody has spoken up and said, this is wrong. Everything's fine. No reason to change the policies. You don't need OIR to tell you that everything's not fine. You know it's not fine. So I'm asking that everybody please, and finally, Wisconsin Act 348. I was on the team to get that bill passed. It got stripped of everything that mattered. It's left with DCI, offers a couple investigators, and they delegate a lot of responsibility to the department involved in the shooting. So perhaps MPD doesn't want to conduct their own internal review because they're already conducting the criminal investigation for the most part. There's just an appearance of objectivity, but it's not really happening. So please, we only get one shot at this. Everybody's working so hard, and I so appreciate that, but I'm asking the people that have internal information from the Madison Police Department to contribute as honestly as possible and stop trying to shut the public down. It's not going to work.
Thank you, Amelia. Jury? Jury? We can come back. We'll keep moving. We'll come back. Payton Yang.
All right. Hello.
Hi.
My name is Payton Yang, and I am a youth leader at Freedom Inc. and a part of an amazing youth organization team, Freedom Youth Squad. I am here today to talk about how the contract between Madison Police and Madison schools are impacting children of color at schools here. Why are they horrible for children, you might ask? Well, because of people of color are still treated unequally to this very day. And every second, a black mother, father, son, and a daughter is being incarcerated, harmed, or killed by the police outside or inside of schools. How everyone doesn't acknowledge any of these incidents or just brush it off because people of color are lazy or are just criminals, as the media portrays. As it says in the contract, each individual school in Madison is spending $360,000 for cops in schools. And that's not improving anything for our children in schools. Instead, it's invested in cops. Students around the nation are harmed and are harassed by police almost every day. Does Madison want to contribute to such violence, or do we want to move into a healthier way for students to strive in? I know what we can do better, and this is why we are here today. We say that this money can go into better purposes of education and future, and to also terminate the contract between Madison School and Madison Police Department. This money can go into youth of color who don't have free reduced lunch, or into more air conditioners and clean bathrooms. This is examples of what they all need. I also have a friend. His name is Ebes. He came to West High School this one after school night for a club, but an ERO came to him and gave him a ticket for just chilling in the hallway. And it was $100, and a $100 citation. And that's just ridiculous of how we have harsh policies and policing for students, especially a student who is already struggling to get to school and has to pay a citation worth of $100. He was crying to me as he told me that he couldn't afford any of it. This marks my point that cops are very harmful for students of color, not just with the eye, but mentally, verbally, and physically. So I hope you all take these stories, real stories, into consideration. Think about your children's futures. Think about those you care, because you all are sitting on this table today that gives you power to make changes. Changes not just for the law or the city, but changes for the lives of people. We have 3 demands we want, and it's to, 1, to terminate the contract between Madison School District and Madison Police Department, 2, invest this money into youth of color, and 3, students and community members get to choose what they want to learn. Thank you for my time up here. Please, please take this into your hearts.
Thank you. Is jury back in the room?
Hello, my name is Jury, and I am a youth staff at Freedom Inc. I am here opposing the contract between MMSD and MPD. I have been attending the MMSD Ad Hoc Committee meetings for almost a year and a half, and I can honestly say that there is no logical reason to have police in schools. Police are very aggressive and hostile, and specifically towards students of color. I feel as if police are a waste of money and effort. Police are only present 13% of the time at school incidents. When police arrest students of color specifically at school, most of the time, these incidents did not occur on school property. Black students are targeted by police in schools. It's not a statistic, it's not in some report, or not on a data sheet. You're hearing it out of the mouths of youth of color. Many students, including myself, have received abuse from our school's EROs. We often are verbally and sometimes even physically threatened and harassed. A student that I'll call DJ for confidential reasons was breaking up a fight in my high school in my sophomore year and was slammed by an ERO, later to have a concussion. We at Freedom Inc. are demanding that the cops be taken out of our schools and demand that the school invest the money used for cops to go towards students of color and to make sure that we are provided with necessary supplies such as food, transportation, and support and resources that we need to thrive, and that our families and students have control of school discipline and safety. Many youth of color feel the same. Madison has been said to be the worst place to raise a child of color. And to add police into our schools aren't making it any better. You have youth of color sitting here telling you, from our own experiences, that cops are more harmful than helpful. Takes cops out of school, they're choosing property over our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, are there any disclosures and refusals at this point in time? Okay, if not, we will move forward. And before going to discussion item number one, we do have Dr. G, who will be coming back and speaking to us on item number one.
Hello. I would ask that you suspend the rules to allow members of the public to participate in the debate. I'm going to go on to talk about some of the items you're going to talk about. I initially had something written up for the waiting period item, but instead, because I'm not sure if I'll have an opportunity to speak again, I thought I'd just speak extemporaneously about the use of force and why I feel that the OIR recommendations are really proper and should be adopted. Just two experiences. About 20 years ago, I was involved in a use of force incident. This was a couple decades ago. Some people may say, well, so long ago that's not relevant. I feel it still is relevant. I participated in civil disobedience at Truex Field. It was well orchestrated, nonviolent, not loud. I knew I'd be arrested. What I didn't expect what occurred subsequently. The officer who arrested me clearly had a difference with our politics. He tightened the cuffs on me as hard as he possibly could, creating severe pain in my hands. He then tossed me, along with two other people, in the back of the squad car. And we expected to be driven downtown, to the police station. Instead, he drove us out in the country, swerving, hitting bumps really hard, slamming on the brakes. I was in excruciating pain. It was some of the worst pain I've had in my life. We were being tossed around the back of the car. When we finally he drove us downtown. When we got to the police station, I had severe nerve damage. I had no sensation in my thumb. I had no sensation in my thumb for a year. Eventually, things heal. Eventually, it returned. I filed a complaint. When I went to file the complaint, they tried to discourage me from doing so. They said, look, he's known to do this. He's near retirement, I said, I don't want him, to be fired, but he can't be doing this to people. And I was never called up and interviewed. And the witnesses, the other two witnesses who provided them the information for, who were in the back of the car, were never interviewed. Another incident I'll talk about that most people aren't aware of involves Matt Kenney. After the killing of Tony Robinson, there were media requests and some information was released. One of the requests was, what are the prior use of force incidents that Matt Kenney was involved in? The department said, well, it'd be too hard to really dig up all the incidents over the years, but we'll release, stuff that we have, about another minute, if possible. We'll release what we have, from the last couple of years that's been collated. Looking through that, one of the incidents, Matt Kenney was sent to, in a case where somebody was basically like drunk and disorderly. He claimed in his report that the person deliberately injured themselves by deliberately, repeatedly bashing their head into the door frame so that they could then, file a complaint against him or sue him. That's what he said in his report. There were 3 other officers who filed reports, a couple of them very detailed. There was nothing like that in their reports. 2 days later, one of the officers amended their report to be consistent with Kenney's, saying, yeah, that's right. The guy kept deliberately bashing his head into the door frame to injure himself. As far as I know, a complaint was never filed. If you just investigate cases in which complaints are filed, you're going to be missing a lot of stuff that needs to be really reviewed. In the first instance, that I talked about, it wouldn't even qualify as use of force under the current MPD guidelines. Until after the Freddie Gray incident, when they started talking about rough rides, I didn't even know that was a common police practice. That's what happened. They basically try to bash you around with a rough ride. So I strongly ask that you adopt all of the OIR recommendations as written, and I also request that the rules be suspended to allow public to participate in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our public comment for this moment, and we'd like to thank you all for your participation and your heartfelt testimonies. At this point in time, before we move into discussing item number one, I would just like to let everyone know that on the phone right now, we have two people. We have the co-chair, Keith Findley, is on the phone. Keith, are you there?
I am here.
All right, very good. We can hear you. And then, of course, we have the head of OIR himself, Mike Gianarco. Mike, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
All
Hello,
right.
everyone.
Thank you for being here with us tonight, Mike.
You bet, Tom.
All right, very good. So with that
And
being
Tom,
said,
can I just add that I would like to offer a personal thanks to Mike for his willingness to participate in this and all of our future meetings discussing the OIR recommendations, despite the fact that the contract is now expired and that he's no longer being paid to do this. So thank you very much, Mike. I'm sure your contributions will be very helpful.
yeah, and thank you again. Thank you, Mike. And for those of you who may not heard that, I'm not sure if the sound traveled all the way to the back, but Mike Gianarco, the head of the OIR group, has agreed graciously to join us for future meetings to kind of just help us as needed to clarify and verify clear and concise information from them so that there is no confusion in it, which we are very grateful to have him doing that, and he is also doing that at no charge. So again, we just want to extend our gratitude for him being present to do such. With that being said, we're going to get started with item number one. And for sakes of the public, we will be starting with item number 78. We will be reading the recommendation so that each and every one of you will understand.
I'd like to make a motion before we begin the discussion to amend the rules to allow for additional public input and for the committee to ask members of the community questions.
Okay, it has been second. Any further discussion? No? Okay. We will now open it up to the committee for discussion on suspending the rules. As we understand it, by suspending the rules, we will allow various members of the public to be able to stand up, share their comments, their opinions, and their suggestions. What we would do, I think if we decide to go that route, is we want to pay close attention to the time. Again, giving everybody the opportunity to speak, but keep it within, but keep it within a respectable time limit and respectable of all the people that are in the room. I think it is a huge benefit. Certainly, we do want the public to know that this committee is transparent, that this committee is open, and certainly open and want to hear your views and your perspectives as we move forward with these important decisions that we have to make on these recommendations. So we wanted to get that out. Luis, would you like to?
Yeah, I would like to ask the city attorney's office for an opinion on it. I don't know if your office, Marcy, has taken a position on it, but are there any legal complications to us adopting the rule? Is there a precedent for doing this? Is there history, both positive and negative?
So you can vote as a committee to suspend the rules and have public testimony. It has to be a vote of 2/3 of the committee members. You can decide among the committee if you want to.
Is it possible, Marcy?
Yeah?
Is it possible for you to get closer to a microphone? I'm having trouble hearing you.
You want me to go that way?
Loud and clear. Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, what I had said was you could vote as a committee to suspend the rules and hear public testimony. I don't know if you want to do that on each, if you're going to go through each of the OER recommendations, if you want to do that overall for the entire meeting today. It has to be a vote of 2/3 of the members of the committee have to agree to suspend the rules and take public testimony on, I don't know if what you're looking to do, if you want to do it on each OER recommendation as you go through them, or how the committee is looking to proceed on this issue.
I would think that if we're going to be open about all of this, I would think it would apply to all.
That was my intent with the motion.
I think Alder would like to.
Alder Sheila.
I want to say that to the question of precedent, there is actually precedence especially for committees where we feel like the ongoing discussion is really important. So on the president work group that we had of alders discussing MPD policy, we did actually suspend the rules of residents being able to participate during the rest of the conversation for the committee's rules as a whole. So we just took a vote and said we were suspending, and then we actually put it as a, tried to put it as a note on the agenda that the rules were suspended.
Did you maintain a certain level of decorum, like people raise their hand, or did they
So what, and that, very good question. What I heard Linda say, and I think it would be good to clarify, is that you would suspend the rules so that if committee members want to ask a question of the public, you would be able to do that. So that's one way, or you can have it very open that if a member of the public raises their hand that you would call it in. I would just ask you to clarify what it is so that everybody knows how you're going to be doing it. But certainly the chair is still responsible for maintaining like order, and calling on people is not just like you come to the table and interrupt. One of the Robert Rules of Order is regardless of what rule you suspend, you shouldn't interrupt people. So clearly that still is maintained, but I think you should clarify.
So yeah, I'd be happy to clarify my motion. I would like to suspend, my motion is to suspend the rules and allow for the public to have continued input, as well as committee members be able to ask questions of the community. Yes.
Gloria.
And I just want to add that, you guys went through this before early on. As you recall, the two chairs, Luis and Christian, you developed this process. And I think because of the transition of the new co-chairs, I think it's just been forgotten. I think the issue was when the last meeting is of our participants coming up to individuals' ears and whispering, and that did not allow for an open discussion during the discussion. So I just wanted to clarify that it is, you guys have done this. It has been very transparent, and I think it's just because of the switch of the co-chairs that some of the rules were forgotten. So I just wanted to remind you that is, you guys have done this before. Dr. Galambak was here with you throughout the whole contracting process, wrote the contract essentially. So it was very transparent. So I just wanted to make that clear that you guys have done this. It's not a new issue. You've encountered this early on in the process.
Okay, committee members, are there any further discussion necessary before voting?
No, I think we should suspend the rules and allow people to have input, but I just want it to be very clean in the way we do it. So whether any of us want to invite Dr. Glembiak or any other person in the community to say, hey, I'd like to get their input on it, and then maybe say, can we hear from them for a minute or two? Maybe put some structure around it so that way it's just clean in the way we go about doing it.
Yeah, and I think, being respectful of everyone in the room as well, I totally agree. So with that being said, we will now take a vote. Those in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 Those opposed? Abstain? All right, motion carries.
Mr. Chair, can I just make one more comment before you start your deliberation? So at the Common Council Executive Committee, we discussed at our last meeting, we got an update from your chairs, and we discussed really how important to all of us your work is. especially for those of us who really were worked on creating this committee and the OIR report funding. So we have decided that it would be really important for a council member, specifically a council member that was on the MPD president's work group, to attend your meetings. So we are making it, I'm not going to guarantee 100% of anything in our older lives, but we are going to make it a goal to be present. And I'm not going to try to sway or intervene into your deliberation, because I'm sure I will have a kick at that can when it gets to the council. But I am here if you have any questions that have to do with anything that's council relating, procedural, process-wise, how it's going to move along, any of that kind of thing that I can be of assistance to you. I want to be here. Or if there is any information that you want me to interim take back to the Common Council Executive Committee. So that's what my role is going to be.
Thank you so much. Okay, with that being said, is the public clear on that? The motion has been passed. So thank you very much, everybody who's just participated. And I just want to say before we get started again here that this is a big task that we have. This is not easy. And we've heard the phrase that it takes a village. Well, it certainly takes a village, and as I look around the room, I think about it, and this is a village in this room. This is a village of different folks from different cultures with different backgrounds, different beliefs, and different perspectives. But when you put it all together, there is one purpose, is to make sure that it benefits everyone. And that's how I look at community. So the challenge is issued to us tonight, and I assure you that we're going to do our best to meet that challenge, to be, again, as transparent, as detailed and concise and clear as we possibly can. Is that all right with you guys out there? All right, very good. Okay, so we're going to move in and get started with item number 78. Again, we will read the items. This is recommendation number 78. Sure, Jerry.
Thank you, members of the public, for being here. I really appreciate you guys being here. I just wanted to ask one thing. I'm not sure how to resolve it, but I want to throw it out because it's going to be part of our conversation here. I know we're trying to be transparent, but one thing I've noticed in working, and maybe it's me, but I wanted to share that it's been very hard to gather all the information. All the information that we've done, from the recommendations, what we have adopted, what we have not adopted, has been a little bit more piecemeal. And I'm just suggesting, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm looking to you guys. Is there a better way to organize this in a way that the community can track our progress, easier for them to track our progress? Because I know we have the information, but I want to make sure that they know exactly where we are, what we've done. I know you can go back to the minutes and look at that and actually track that, but that's not very easy to do. And I know that, why make it more harder? Is there a way to make it much more easier, much more transparent?
Gloria, please.
So we do have a website that it was a website designated for keeping the public updated on OIR's process. So we could put this, your work, on that website, if that would be helpful. If you think that that would be helpful, that's probably something we could accomplish.
I think there's been a lot of different folks that have been wondering about the updates and progress and where we are and everything like that in a lot of different circles. I think it'd absolutely be helpful to be able to just point people in a direction.
So what we would want is just to rely on you all to provide us the exact information that you would want on there. We want this to come from the committee.
Yeah.
So we would, put exactly what you give us to put on the website. That's exactly what OIR did, is that they gave us what exactly they wanted on the website, so.
And then I would have one more question. Jerry, thanks for asking that question. That's a good question. Now, aren't these proceedings being recorded, Rachel?
Yeah, well.
Okay, so does the public have access to reviewing some of this information?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we're going to want to make that very clear to them, how to utilize the links as well as the website that Gloria has alluded to. Very good. Alder Sheba.
One suggestion there is like the minimum that you can do is link on that web landing page to the meeting minutes, dates, all of that. So that's the first easy one, so that if people land on that page as opposed to going to look for committee meetings, that they will be able to link back to your committee's meetings, minutes, all of that from that page that right now has the OIR study. So.
Hey, can we like write the website on the board or something like that, like so people know what it is? Because I don't really have any. Sure, I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria.
So, I think you think about what I've heard as far as questions I've asked. I think absolutely we should have on there kind of a direct link to past and future meetings, as well as the minutes and recordings, and then if possible our progress as we go through the OIR recommendations and where we're at, what we've approved, what haven't we approved, or as much as we can as far as kind of where it's at, the amendments we made, the changes we made in some of the recommendations, in the wording, so people can see for themselves what kind of where we currently are within it.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question too. I think it would be beneficial for members of the public. I know it helps us when we engage city staff around technicalities that we have in terms of, like when we have Chief Wall and Captain Schaaf here. But there's one city staff member that I'm not familiar with, so if city staff can introduce themselves, especially city staff to the right, because I'm not sure who she is. Sorry.
This is just our prosecution intern.
Okay, awesome. I wanted to make sure that I knew, so. Like, we know we have the use of force coordinator, right?
Mary, why don't you guys introduce yourselves as well, just so the public kind of knows. Yeah, Keith?
Tom?
Go ahead, Keith.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could I make a request? Could I just please encourage everyone who speaks to speak into a microphone? Sure. Some people can be heard on the phone very clearly, but those who are not right on the microphone are almost impossible to hear.
Yeah, real quick.
The committee members don't all know me, so I'll kind of try to talk in turn. My name is Mary Schaaf. I'm the captain of training for the police department, and I serve as staff to the ad hoc committee. And we'll have Kimba introduce himself again, please.
And for those who didn't catch it, my name is Kimba too. I'm a sergeant with the Madison Police Department and the current use of force coordinator in Brighton.
You guys have met Alder Sheba, so Gloria, did you want to introduce quickly?
Gloria Reyes, Deputy Mayor to Public Safety, Department of Civil Rights, Community Development Division, and Public Health.
Thank you. Okay, I think it is.
Yeah, sorry. Quickly, just one more thing. We receive a lot of critical information, a lot of input from the public. Some of it comes in writing in the form of excellent articles that Dr. Gellenbeck shares with us. I think that those should be shared with the public as well. So I would make a request that that information, for the sake of openness, that we place that on the website as well. And also that when we receive that kind of information that will be used as part of the discussion, for example, for the next meeting, that be shared with everyone, which includes city staff as well.
Yeah,
Okay?
I don't ever get those emails, so I can't put them in the public record if I don't get them.
So, chairs, I think if you receive it, if you forward it to Rachel, that's my request. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Anyone else want to chime in real quick before we get started? Okay, very good. Okay, so Mike and Keith, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I hear you great.
All right, so we're going to get started with recommendation number 78. And that recommendation reads as follows. MPD should make clear through policy and training that an officer who witnesses another officer use of force is required to report it and document his or her observations in a supplemental report.
I'll make the motion, we approve recommendation 78.
Second.
And in terms of further discussion, if I could just clarify that on the chart, I've not coded this as one where the Madison Police agrees or disagrees because it wasn't clear to me. What is clear is that MPD's current policy is not to require that every officer who observes every use of force must report it, but rather that they have to do so only if they observe excessive force, and they often do report other uses of force, but they're not required to do so. So current policy is not consistent with this. But the MPD response goes on to say that they will review whether additional SOP language or training is needed on this. So it's not clear to me what position they are taking on this at this point.
Okay, Keith, thank you very much. I'm going to refer to Mary on that. Mary, would you like to offer?
So regarding item number 78, this is in the process of being reviewed. And just for clarification on what the policy says now, the current, or the clarification is, as officers go into any use of force, obviously if they see a use of force that's outside of the boundaries of acceptable force, they would report that, and that gets reported through other mechanisms, not necessarily through the police report, but it could be in the form of a complaint. And the way that officers, and what our policy says and the way they're trained, is that officers are told that you are reporting your use of force based on your observations that you make. So each officer, if they come into a situation, they're seeing what other officers, if I go into a situation, I see an officer taking certain actions, and that's going to inform how I respond, then I would say, I saw Officer X doing these things, I interpreted it to mean this, therefore I did these following actions to support that effort, or whatever my actions are to support it. We do not require that they report every single, so if I see Officer, or Sergeant 2, excuse me, Sergeant, if I see him handcuff somebody, I wouldn't be required to say I watched him handcuff somebody. It didn't inform any further actions from me. He's required to report that in his report and document it that way. So we don't want to get that double redundancy where if 5 officers watch somebody handcuff somebody, and this is kind of the more extreme example, you don't want 5 supplemental reports saying I watched so-and-so handcuff, especially in a compliant situation where it's a compliant handcuffing. But we are looking at the language of this and looking at ways to kind of see if there needs to be some modification to it. But I think that kind of gets toward avoiding that redundancy with multiple reports. Officers are expected to do it to the extent that it informs their decision-making, obviously, and what the actions that they take. One of the other nuances about use of force, and I'll mention it here, and it may come up again in our discussions, is that it's when you go into a situation, you're using all of your body senses to make decisions about your course of action. You see things, you hear things, you smell things, you feel resistive tension. And that's something that another officer doesn't necessarily, they aren't going to have that same, because everybody's perspective on what happens comes from their vantage point, their perspective, the shoes they're in at the time. And so that's one of the things just to be mindful of as we discuss this, is that I'll give the example, if I'm holding onto someone's arm and they decide, okay, I'm going to use a technique, it's a passive resistance technique where they just let their body go limp, and they go limp and I fall down on top of them, did I throw that person down and jump on them, or did that person drop their body weight and pull me down on top of them? So it's distinctions like that, and perspective is important in use of force, always. Perspective is important. And so our take on this, we're looking at firming up the language there, but just kind of have a blanket statement that every single thing you witness as far as a potential officer use of force reported by everybody that sees it is very redundant. Do you have anything to add, Sergeant?
No, I think that sums it. Sorry. I believe that sums it up. I think the main point for us anyway, in terms of like how we're trained from the state of Wisconsin, they direct us to, again, report on what we do, our actions and our individual justification. Certainly, as the captain said, if another officer's action informs our decision, that's relevant, we would include that in a report. But just from a, I suppose, efficiency standpoint, if every time an officer showed on scene and had to report everyone else's activity or action, you took a statement from that witness, well, I'm going to also take a statement, or rather write in my report that you took that statement and the contents of that interview, there'd be no end of it. So kind of to the captain's point, if the real concern here is that we are addressing issues of excessive force, for example, issues where we have some maybe inappropriate action, that is already addressed by our discipline matrix and our policy in that regard, and that will be reported through a different mechanism, internal affairs professional standards. So hopefully that kind of clarifies why one and not the other, because a blanket statement would require, as it's written anyway in this recommendation, every use of force. We're again kind of duplicating that work. So
I just want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. It seems like there may be a definitional question about what constitutes a use of force. So I wonder if Mike Giannaco, if you could address that. What did you envision this applying to every compliant application of handcuffs, or what were you intending this to mean?
Sure. What we are looking for here is officers have a requirement to report when they use force. And we have seen times in which, and if they don't, that is a violation of the SOP. So what we are looking for here is to make sure that a force incident is reported. And certainly that responsibility should lie with the officer who uses force. But what if that officer chooses not to report force? That's the scenario that we're trying to get at. And since the officers who are witnessing force are already on scene and see it, they can certainly report it and also report to the sergeant or whoever the supervisor is that, as far as they could tell from their vantage point, the force that was used seemed to be justified, but just to make sure that that force is reported. Because there are times that we have... Go ahead.
Just to clarify the question, the thing that I'm struggling with is what constitutes a use of force? Any laying on of hands, or I think we just need some definitional clarity about what we're talking about. Is when is this reporting requirement, as you said, triggered? What constitutes a use of force?
Yeah, there's the use of force, and then there's reportable force. And the recommendation doesn't intend to enlarge the responsibility of reporting. All it is saying is that if you see another officer use force that should be reported, you ought to report it as well. And as far as collecting information, in the same way that if there are eyewitnesses, civilian eyewitnesses of force, you'd want to get their version of what happened and what they saw. The officer who's a witness, you'd want her or his version as well in order to have a complete assessment of what that force is. Some of this has gone away and become less important in agencies that have adopted body cameras, but Madison doesn't have that. So this is why this is really critical that witness officers should be required also to report the force. The redundancy is an issue, but so what? I mean, you want to make sure that that force is reported, and not to have a reportable force fall through the cracks.
I'd like to build off of that real quick. Again, I don't understand like the objection to redundancy, particularly when it comes to public servants and their interaction with the public, and potentially, we're talking about use of force here. So again, that's people's well-being, and their physical well-being and their psychological well-being. To me, redundancy is really an erroneous point when it comes to people's well-being and making sure everything is going well. And then secondly, the idea that somehow an outside perspective or a third-party perspective, even though they might not have all their senses engaged, whether it be a civilian witness or an officer witness of a use of force incident, to somehow have something to add to it because they weren't, they didn't have their hands on, so they couldn't feel the tension is I don't know, I find it preposterous. We constantly review as third parties like everything in this world without knowing like direct details. We do reviews of, again, plane crashes without being, the pilot there. We do reviews of surgeries without knowing, everything that was there. Because the recordings are like all this stuff, and for some reason this ends when it comes to our police officers that we can't have, or somehow it's kind of weird, or we can't question this as a third-party perspective. Being an officer or a civilian is it's preposterous. We don't think of that anywhere else in our society. This goes into this recommendation and other recommendations. It just doesn't stand up outside of any kind of legality, and I know that the implication wasn't saying that there's no good that can come from a third-party, perspective, but at the same time, this is kind of dismissal of it, and that goes into the use of force spectrum that's there, and Graham v. Connor, that we can't question the mindset of an officer there, and have this review. It's completely backwards to me. And so kind of with that, all that said, I don't see why there, on our part as a committee, really any debate around 78. It's straightforward. It fills gaps in where there could potentially be gaps, with the only really objections being potential redundancy, which trying to do a cost-benefit, cost analysis of this is a very low cost, and in some aspects might be benefit to implementing this.
People have been videotaping police behavior and challenging Graham versus Connor. Well, at least in Wisconsin, there isn't an uptick of officer fatalities as the result. And that was the big concern, that if suddenly officers were being asked to be more careful about force, then they might panic and get killed because they were doing so. Well, we're not seeing that with this increase of exposure. There aren't more officers dying as a result, which many of us said that would be the case, but here we are. And I'd also like to point out that I think this is critically important because I recently requested records on the past 2 or 3 years of internal harassment incidents where one officer harassed another. And recently a field training officer was able to retire after years of harassing recruits and women. And it took a new officer to complain about him, and he retired. He was able to retire because he had been there long enough, and he had even said to the officers he was training that you can go ahead and tell on me because I'm old enough to retire anyway. So that mentality was able to safely exist within the police department. So I think that, and nobody reported him. It was up to a new officer to have to do that, which I can only imagine was really intimidating. So erring on the side of over-reporting might be it seems like the right direction to go in right now. And if if you find that there's an uptick in officers getting hurt, then maybe we who knows? But erring on the side of over-reporting seems like the safest idea. So, thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. Let's go to Mary first.
I just have some information, Mr. Janaco's clarification. Actually, he had mentioned that he was looking at use of force reporting not as a global all uses of force, but he used the term the reportable force. And I'd like Sergeant Tu to kind of explain to the committee. I think it would help inform what specifically we're saying with reportable force, please.
Sure. Just real briefly, we do make a distinction in the police department, reportable force, meaning a report is required, and then recordable force being that which is collected in our use of force database, and that those records are obviously released quarterly to our website. In terms of reportable, I think it was alluded to, but I don't know if we ever answered the question. Reportable force, to their point, is anytime an officer uses any type of physical force, whether it's recordable for statistical purposes or not. So that would include handcuffing of compliant subjects, literally a push, a shove, an escort hold. All those things would be considered reportable force, and those are, by our non-deadly force standard operating procedure, required to be reported. That is required narrative in a report. An officer must do that. To their point, if, again, that doesn't happen, there are other means, there would be other mechanisms if we find, again, that someone used force and didn't put it into a report, that would go like any other complaint to our professional standards, internal affairs, and again, follow up potentially up to and including discipline would be appropriate.
We have disciplined staff for failing to report. That's true. Could you talk a little bit? So I guess I want to just make sure officers are required to report all the force they use in the field, everything from verbal orders all the way through the spectrum. Recordable force, which is the force database that we collect, is a little bit different, and I don't know if you would like more information on that. And Mr. Janaco, I think were you kind of getting toward that it's the stuff that goes into that use of force database? That's how I understood your comment.
That's right, yes.
Thank you. And would you just make sure that the committee understands what that means?
Sure. And then one other thing then, to speak to the reportable force, the things that require a report, an officer to do a narrative report, would also include threats and displays of force. So those currently are not tracked in our database for recordable force for statistical purposes. We do not track that specifically, but an officer points a gun, officer threatens OC or a taser, that requires a report. And again, if they don't do a report, if there's not a narrative report, case report, again, they could be subject to investigation and discipline for that, if that helps clarify what we're talking about.
And I think in some regards it negates the argument I made earlier with compliant handcuffing. It's required to be in the officer's report. It's not something that's going to go into the use of force database. So just clarify that point.
Thank you, Mary. I would just like to piggyback on that and just ask a question myself. And my question would be, how many cases have we had that have been identified and recognized and reported that we are aware of as of today?
I'm sorry, are you asking what the current numbers are?
Yes, that have been reported, recognized and reported, and public knowledge as of today.
Just to clarify, not to put too fine a point on it, do you mean recordable force? What our statistics show for recordable force?
That have been reported, these particular cases that have actually transpired, how many have been reported?
At this level.
Yeah.
To recordable force? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
So we have 2 years worth of data that we can talk about, that we have access to and run a report. They're all on our website. So if you go to the City of Madison website and the Madison Police Department in particular and click on the data tab, from 2016 we had 230 cases of recordable force, and in 2017 we had 229 roughly. So we're right around the 230 mark in both years for recordable force.
And so currently the MPD, so what I'm assuming is they want to have that second officer, a third or fourth, fifth officer that observed the reportable force to be required now to make a statement or a supplemental report on that.
Yes, that's our understanding of this recommendation. So not for the recordable force, not in these 230, 229 instances, but for all instances. Because, and I want to make sure I'm understanding the question. If you're asking me specifically, are you asking me specifically for the numbers of reportable force?
that have been reported to this point thus far?
That we don't have numbers on.
So the difference between reportable and reportable. And I think it's a minor word difference, but there's a big distinction, because what Mr. Giannacco is referring to is the reportable force. Those are those higher level instances of use of force. So it's not the lower level things. So the language does matter here, because reportable is different than recordable to us.
And I just
that's
wanted
the
to,
distinction we're making.
I think, well, for my, it does look like it would fill a good gap if they require additional officers to make a report on reportable force, because maybe, for instance, and I think Mike was trying to get at this. Say, for instance, there's an officer that felt like the use of force that another officer used was excessive, but maybe they don't feel comfortable in reporting that. So, but if there's a standard that it just says anytime reportable force is being used, we have to create a report on it. So I like that gap that it fills with that, but I want to have a better understanding of what the implication of this would be like practically. So you're saying if there were 7 officers that saw a reportable use of force, they'd have to go into their creating of the report. Would they have to interview that same witness 7 times potentially?
Let me see if I can handle this one, because the way I understand your question. So, and what I said earlier is when an officer goes into a scene, especially in multiple officer scenes, depending on where your focus is, you may or may not see every use of force. But when you see an officer pointing a firearm, or you see a taser out, and these are all those things that fall under the umbrella of what Mr. Giannacco was referring to under the recordable standard.
No, reportable.
Reportable, excuse me. Reportable. I've been mixing my things. Those higher level things, officers, those are the kinds of cases where it does actually inform officers' actions, because you're coming into a situation, you see certain things happening. Now, me as an officer coming in, if there's a group of us, will I see absolutely everybody's use of force or what options they're deploying at any given time? Probably not, that's human. But if there are certain things that I see, then I think that's what we're kind of referring to, those higher level things. And those are definitely the things that, from my experience, end up in the reports that the officers say, I came upon the scene, so-and-so was doing X, Y, Z, pointing a firearm, had a taser out, giving orders, because that's going to inform what they do next.
And I just want to know, is Mike, if you can hear me, was a part of the purpose of this recommendation to see if any policy was there an error on the officer that these other officers are reporting on? Like, if you could allude on that.
Well, there's a couple things going on there. One is that certainly if an officer sees force that is inappropriate and wrong and outside the bounds and it's clear, then not only does that officer have an obligation to report it, he or she should try to stop it. But I'm talking more about ensuring that reportable force gets reported. And as the folks at MPD have indicated, sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes a complaint will be filed by the person, usually upon force has been used, and that may then trigger an internal investigation and some accountability. What if the person doesn't do that? What if the complainant just takes his lump, not report it, not complain about it, and the officer who used the force doesn't report it, but there's an officer who witnesses it but has no obligation to report it?
Okay.
And that's the scenario we're trying to capture here, so that the department is fully aware and apprised that every time an officer reports force, and there are some times in which an officer's self-interest might get in the way of that reporting requirement, and therefore let's use witness officers to ensure that that reporting is done.
Yeah, that helps a lot, actually. Thanks.
Sorry, just a clarification question that I wanted to ask. If there is 5 officers involved in an incident, does everybody has to do a report? on what happened, from what their role was, what they did, and they may be doing different things. I understand one may be talking to this person, one to that, they may observe something, but everybody's reporting, right? They are doing a written report of their involvement in that incident. So wouldn't this requirement, whether it's the reportable or the recordable, that's a decision point, right? But wouldn't this just be adding to that they already have to do, just making it very specific that if there is any either reportable or recordable use of force, that they are actually specifically obligated, if you were to recommend this, to make a point of reporting that within their already report that they're doing?
If it's in the report, potentially, yes.
Okay.
And it's, and I think that the other piece of it is the back end piece that's already, and I know it comes up in a future recommendation, is the whole auditing of those types of cases, which is taking place now, and so we'll wait.
But I mean, the reason I was asking this question is because I heard a concern about additional workload from the officer having to do things, but they have to report anyways, right?
And I kind of was framing that with the earlier, before Mr. Giannako's clarification, where, because there's some, it was pretty general in the original recommendation.
Got it.
But they would just be capturing more potentially pertinent information that would maybe not get reported without this policy recommendation, correct? Well, I think Mike cleared it up for me, but it just seems like.
You can tell by my look.
I didn't know how to word that, but yeah.
So if it's just like a basic use of force, but my partner is being excessive and causing harm.
If your partner is excessive and causing harm, we have in our policies, our SOPs, our code of conduct, you have a duty to intercede, and you have a duty to report that. And so that's, no matter what type of force, if you see somebody abuse, and it goes even to abusing authority, it could be something, a verbal unlawful order would even qualify for that, because that would be considered abuse of your authority.
So can I get clarification here, Mary? Given that Mike's clarification that he's talking about reportable uses of force, are you still resistant to that, or are you in agreement with that now?
No, I think what I can say is that we are looking at that, we are already kind of evaluating that piece of it, and looking at how that language should be structured. I am not a part of that current discussion group, but I know that work is in progress.
But related some of your concerns.
Yes.
Okay. Can I just make an additional comment, and that is in support of recommendation 78, and that is in a scenario, a situation that we're in right now, where we're trying to find ways to end the distrust that exists between some communities and the Madison Police Department, especially around use of force, requiring every officer who observes a reportable use of force to make a report, but has the additional virtue of impressing on each of the police officers and the community that every use of force, whether ultimately justified or not, but every use of force is a significant, momentous, serious event and needs to be treated that way. So I think this recommendation would advance that in a way that could perhaps help chip away at the distrust that currently exists.
Thanks, Keith. Mario?
Just wanted to say that this is a very critical issue for me, and I think that it's really, it has caused a lot of harm in our community, the couple incidents that have been really public. So I believe that kind of like the spirit behind this is to increase and elevate that accountability and transparency aspect. So let's not forget that, and keep in mind as we navigate the complexities of the recordable use of force and the reportable use of force. And I couldn't but just to think about the incident at the East Town Mall, I believe it was last year, a couple of years ago, with Janelle and just watching the interactions and now, for example, reading here that MPD requires officers to intercede and report that situation. So I wonder what reports came up out of that. Was that like recordable? Was that reportable? Did one of the officers try to intercede? Like, was that an excessive force? I think that those are the details that really, at the end of the day, make the difference, and for a large segment of the community, makes it believe that there is not accountability and transparency in those situations. And honestly, I think that that's kind of like where I have difficulty grappling with this issue.
Well, again, without speaking directly to specific cases, Janelle Laird's incident that was reviewed internally, it was also reviewed by an external, Dane County Sheriff's Department, which is again unprecedented. We don't typically have outside agencies review uses of force that are not officer-involved shootings, but that was. So, to be fair and to be clear, there was some effort for that transparency and for accountability, that it wasn't just an internal review of it, but an outside agency also looked at it and also cleared the officers. But that being said, your point is well made and well taken as far as if there are concerns, and we've mentioned this, if there are concerns, if someone from the public, a witness, because a witness doesn't have to be another officer, a witness observes it, right, and they deem it to be excessive, the other means by which that can be reported and brought to the attention of the department is that witness to step forward, to contact the supervisor, to, again, take it to internal affairs, and again, that will be then investigated by our professional standards internal affairs, and again, that's kind of its own process, but it does absolutely lend itself to accessibility and accountability. If people have an issue, they're watching and witnessing something that they deem to be inappropriate from the police department, they absolutely, and we have a mechanism for them to bring that forward, bring it to our attention, if that makes sense. So,
does that answer your question, Mario?
Yeah. We understand, yeah.
What is it called, reportable force?
Recordable with a C is what we keep statistics on.
And now, is that about 230 incidents for the past?
2016.
Okay.
2016, and in 2017 it was 29.
And then do you also track data in regard to how many either complaints or appeals come in regard to those 230 incidents from folks who maybe feel it was not just?
We would have that information through our professional standards unit. I don't have that information for you tonight, but that is something that we would know how many use of force complaints. And I don't know that I'm sure there's a mechanism to track it back to case numbers, et cetera, and document it that way. Obviously, if someone filed a complaint and it wasn't already existing, that would be a whole other issue with the reporting pieces we've already mentioned. But that data is available. I don't have it for you tonight, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I just think if you would look at that data, I mean, I would think if you'd see substantially low numbers in comparison to what's being reported, that might be a questionable thing where people aren't reporting. I mean, speaking firsthand from trying to appeal I would say excessive use of force, it was very difficult to navigate the system, and so it is a challenge, and that's coming from someone who has pretty significant background in advocacy and law and that type of stuff. The other thing I do think that's something to think about having a second person doing that reporting is that there is research out there pretty clearly demonstrated that when you have an officer engaged in a pursuit or an activity, there's a heightened level of senses, which you spoke to. You're feeling everything. And what folks found is that if they actually bring in a second officer at that point in time to de-escalate, there's a much lower rate of force because you don't have an officer that's really acting on adrenaline. And so I think that might make sense to having a second person because the way the officer who's engaged in that is perceiving that situation may actually be different than what's actually happening because of their heightened level of sensitivity and kind of that fight or flight mechanism. So
it seems that there is quite broad agreement that you should move forward on this.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have the question. So the question is to adopt recommendation number 78 which sounds like some modifications possibility from the MPD. That is the question. Those in favor?
Aye.
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 Those opposed? Abstain? Motion carries. Thank you all for your input on number 78. Moving forward, the next one is number 79, recommendation, and it reads as follows. MPD should amend its force reporting protocols so that for certain categories of force, supervisors are required to conduct a separate investigation, meeting basic investigative standards sufficient for a thorough and complete review of the incident and the events leading up to it.
I'd like to move to adopt that recommendation as is.
A second.
That with that, and kind of to build off, I guess both in looking at OIR's response to MPD pushing back on this, as well as building off our last comment here. There's a lot of reasons why people don't go to report about use of force. I would imagine, in fact, that most use of force where a civilian might have total estimate, but it wouldn't surprise me, don't go and report a possibility of have a complaint. The process in of itself is arduous. It's massive. You talk about time, privilege, like so many things have to go into it, let alone the will to, particularly if we're talking about vulnerable populations, go and subject themselves to put out a report, potentially exposing themselves to police harassment. I would see it as imperfect as I'm not a believer in police policing themselves, but at least within this, there will be an investigation and a look at if procedures and protocol was indeed followed without forcing somebody to potentially expose themselves to harassment or fear or inaccessibility just because, with complaint. And again, in looking at both his response and my own response to what MPD was saying is that, this is staffing time, but at the same time, what do we want to weigh? Do we want to weigh things actually functioning as they should, supporting people's, health and well-being as we should, or the inconvenience of bureaucracy? And to me, we're talking about an inconvenience of time, and yes, it's resources, yes, these are people's stress, but in essence, that's kind of where we're at in big pushback around this. And again, strain on resources, but I mean, these are people here that deserve to have potential misuse of force looked at, regardless of their capability to actually file a complaint or not.
Thanks, Matt. Mary?
So on this one, I know you have our response in front of you. We are generally supportive of the concept of this, and actually there's some draft SOP language that's already being worked on and looked at as far as we can take it. The big concern, and I believe it's a legitimate concern, is the logistics piece and making sure that we deliver on the promise and that we have adequate supervisors to respond to these and take care of it. I think when I look at it with the thing that, because if we commit to it, we want to make sure we have adequate supervisors to respond. So the work's already in progress on this.
Kind of a quick thing to end.
Could I just get clarification? Could I raise a question here as well? It appears to me that I coded this as read as Madison Police not in agreement. Maybe that, given Mary's response here, that was incorrect. But it seems to me that the one point of contention may come from a sort of a definitional question as to what would require supervisory investigation, because the recommendation is that for certain categories of force, whereas the MPD reads it as every use of force. Mike, could you clarify what do you mean by certain categories of force?
Absolutely, Keith. We left it that way for the very reason that we don't think every resistive handcuffing needs to result in a full-fledged investigation. And we left the recommendation so that the Madison Police Department could come up with a tripwire for the kinds of cases that would be subject to a more thorough investigation instead of just having a report being written. We can provide examples, but it might be helpful for MPD to come up with a category, a kind of case that would trigger an investigation. Some agencies use this category. Any use of force in which the result is observable injury or complaint of significant pain on behalf of the person upon who the force was used, and that's their tripwire. There could be other tripwires. Some agencies define it by the kind of force instrument that's used, and will do investigations involving tasers, batons, and leave it at that. And that's why we wanted to leave room for MPD to come up with that tripwire. But we do think that there is a certain kind of subcategory of force that should be subject to an internal investigation, and as Matthew articulately said, not subject to the whims of whether a person decides to complain about it or not. The integrity of the force review protocols should not be reliant on outside individuals and whether they decide to complain or not, because as Matthew indicated, there's lots of reasons why people complain, and there's a whole lot of reasons why people don't.
Mr. Chair, I think that this is one of those recommendations that we should wholeheartedly, move forward with, and I like that we haven't been completely specific with all of our recommendations. We've allowed the MPD to sort of have some, lateral movement in these recommendations. I think that this is one where probably some more community input should be put into it, so that way the community can define what for certain categories of force actually means, because I think that would be a critical piece of just hearing from community input on that. I'm not saying that anybody from the community needs to tell us today, but maybe we should do more homework on that, so that way we can give maybe an informed community recommendation to the MPD on what the parameters that they think should be within that.
But earlier
Mary, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Given your response and Mike's clarification here, Mike, is it fair to assume that in fact MPD is currently working on this and developing a standard of what those tripwires, as Mike put it, might be for triggering these additional supervisory investigations?
Yes, you're spot on right. It's underway. That work is underway in determining what those, as you call them, tripwires would be, and what should be the standard. And I know there's that draft language is being discussed. So that's
so it sounds like, given that, it sounds like maybe there isn't disagreement between OIR and the MPD on this.
I would say I don't hear disagreement here, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let's go to Veronica first.
So earlier we were talking about recordable versus reportable. So are we able to amend this to add for certain categories of force, at minimum those that are recordable incidents? So we're talking about recordable incidents and reportable incidents, right, before, on number 78. So on this particular one, are we able to amend this so that what it says here, protocol, so that for certain categories of force, at minimum those that are recordable incidents, supervisors are required to conduct blah, 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 blah.
I'd second that.
Okay, for those on, Keith, did you hear that? Mike, did you hear that as well?
I did not.
Could you speak a little bit loud? I know, I think some people could barely hear. Could you speak a
So
little bit louder?
the recommendation 79
Closer
reads,
to a mic.
I am as close as I can be to the mic. And as loud as I can be. So NPD should amend its force reporting protocols so that for certain categories of force, at minimum those that are recordable incidents, supervisors are required to conduct a separate investigation, meeting basic investigative standards sufficient for thorough and complete review of the incident and the events leading up to it.
So did I hear that correctly, that the changes being proposed is to add a certain categories of force at a minimum, including reportable uses of force? Is that the addition?
Yeah.
Yes, recordable.
What?
RC like the soda.
You're recording a movie.
Oh, recordable.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Recordable.
Mary, any comment to the changes?
I think that it's actually somewhat in line with the direction we're debating already, to make sure that that it's the direction we're going.
Are you proposing an amendment?
So
to
I hear that as
I
an
second
offer
the
of a friendly amendment to Matthew's motion.
Matthew
Is that right?
seconds.
That is correct.
Matthew, and you accept that amendment?
Yeah, it's a friendly amendment.
All right, so those in favor of the friendly amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Abstain? Motion carries. Thank you.
The delay.
And thank you all in the audience for being patient with us. Okay, number 80 reads as follows. MPD should adopt policy requiring a supervisor to evaluate whether each use of force was within policy as well as compliance with any other policies implicated, such as the foot pursuit or de-escalation policies, with a supporting analytical narrative that also demonstrates a holistic review of all the circumstances surrounding the use of force.
I'll move to adopt recommendation number 80.
Second.
Any further discussion?
Yeah.
Mary?
Yeah, so we are in agreement with this as well. The person, actually, you're looking at the person who does review absolutely every use of force within the department. Sergeant 2 is the use of force coordinator, reads every single report. The one piece of this, the back end of it where each review would require a narrative is a bit cumbersome. Where there are problems, that's a different story. If there are problematic or there are issues, obviously another narrative report makes sense. But a narrative on absolutely every piece of it becomes, I mean, when we look at, he's reviewing all uses of force in the department. Would you like to discuss that, please?
I'm sorry.
Is it to do an investigation going on? How is it currently documented?
Your review.
Oh, sure. So again, we first check for compliance in terms of the data entry. Does it conform with what the officer reports in their narrative? So again, two different pieces, the data component and then the actual officer's report and narrative. So the first check is just, again, to make sure quality assurance that that's been recorded. Then, of course, there's going to be the review of was it within the constitutional standard, Graham versus Connor, so is it within the objective reasonableness standard of force? Following that, we follow, again, our policy. Is there a violation of any specific policies, MPD policies? Because, again, that can be more restrictive than the law, and in some cases it is. And the last thing is, was it conform and is it consistent with MPD training, which is generally, again, set forth by the state of Wisconsin. So does it conform to the state standard of how that use of force is trained? So those are all those, I guess, layers, if you will, or filters of review on any given use of recordable force.
So is it written? Is it a checklist? How do you record? How do you
because I do those. So I'm accountable in that sense. And how it's tracked is, again, if there isn't a violation of law, constitutional law, if there's not a violation of policy, and if there's not a violation of our practices and training standard, then again, it's adopted into the database, accepted, and again, is there for counting and recording and that kind of thing, reporting out, I should say. To your, I think, question, where do we have those instances where it doesn't conform or there is some question, then that triggers a different process, which means I will send a separate entry to the internal affairs, our professional standards internal affairs, to have it reviewed further. And it's a separate review of from me. And again, that's why I don't get to see what internal affairs does, where it's siloed. If I find something to be, again, deemed to be maybe a violation of the policy of training or the constitutional standard, that is, again, referred to professional standards, and they do their own independent investigation, independent of me currently. And then they make their own findings and, again, impose discipline or recommend discipline as they deem appropriate.
So his written work is when there's a problem, then it's entered as a written product that's subject to further investigative review.
And so there's the checklist of criteria, and if they're all met, then
If there are no violations, there's no narrative or supplemental report that he writes.
So, kind of a quick thing, sorry, and so this specific recommendation is about requiring a supervisor to evaluate within this. And I'm guessing like this, you're talking like a direct, field supervisor, and kind of looking again at OAR's kind of response. This seems to be the only area that MPD does not require initial recommendations or findings by field supervisors. Why is that the case?
So if you can read the response from MPD, the thought was, when we originally created the process, field supervisors, and again, to speak larger, bigger picture, are deemed to be more of generalists. They have to be good at a lot of things, like running tactical calls, obviously knowing criminal investigations, obviously all of our policies, et cetera. So they need to know a lot of things in a lot of areas and be able to, run, for example, calls, tactical calls, as well as, again, make charging decisions or recommendations after officers will review, for example, cases with them, et cetera, and so forth. They don't necessarily have the requisite knowledge to deem, again, from the constitutional standard or policy or training, because, again, they're somewhat removed from those areas, any given use of force. So the decision was made to house that with a so-called person with most knowledge in those areas, in that area specifically of use of force, and that being me, to give it the best, I guess, for lack of a better term, or the most thorough review of those areas.
Okay.
I want to just qualify something here. So a field supervisor going to a scene is going to make a determination if something's within policy or without. You're going to see that they may not have, the piece that they aren't going to have, they may talk to the officers, they talk to witnesses and people at the scene, they won't have the benefit of the report in front of them. And I think what we're seeing at the point where it goes to Sergeant 2, he has all of the documents in front of him, which are all officers' reports, so he gets a broad picture of the entire situation. So the issue could come from a scene supervisor, or it could come from Sergeant 2's more thorough review of reports afterward. And I think that the piece to me that's important here is that there is a consistent process applied to the review by Sergeant 2. He's not thinking of all these other pieces. His sole job is the review of the use of force.
So where does, I guess, the cumbersome comes in, though, then? Like, that's where I'm having, like, this narrative that the field supervisor is going to review that isn't on you. Like, where does this cumbersome come into play?
The cumbersome comes into play if there is no problem on the use of force, does it necessarily drive a document on his behalf to say this was all in compliance with our standard? Does that make sense?
But it's like,
He's done the review, he says this one's good. When they're not good, he documents and it's forwarded.
Right, but in looking at this isn't necessarily for him. This is for the field supervisor, more so than anything. And again, what I'm seeing is something that is a pushback on redundancy or filter, or not necessarily just filters, but a pushback on that redundancy in another layer, again, another set of eyes, even though they may not have the expertise, would still at least, has a generalist knowledge. And I know a lot of times through, my work's a bit different, but, I'll write something up that's, as a generalist within a specific policy area, writing something together, and then I'll pass it along to a specialist to review to make sure as a generalist, like, all right, that's almost kind of what I'm seeing here is that a similar process of redundancy, double checking, and even though it already goes to you, at the same time, there's been times where I've picked up on something that they didn't. And so again, this is just something as far as to me, I just see it as more bumpers of redundancy and filling in any potential gaps or oversights that one person, regardless of expertise, it's like reviewing or editing almost again like a document. You're going to want multiple people regardless of expertise, because one person, it could be a little detail. I know it's a little bit different. You go check whatever, but it's still extra set of eyes is an extra set of eyes. And, I guess it's a long conversation around a small squibble within the differences here. But I don't know, I just kind of see this as something that I don't think is overly cumbersome to implement in a point that would, in essence, create another filter to have things move through.
Thanks. Kim?
I'd like to ask Mike what they mean by narrative report. What would the narrative include if there was no violation? What would the narrative report look like?
Mike, did you hear that?
I'm here. This one, as we indicated in our report, was surprising to us because, we've worked with, close to 200 agencies now, and MPD is actually the first one we've ever encountered where a supervisor isn't required to make a finding as to whether or not force by one of the officers that she or he supervises was within or outside of policy, with a couple sentences explaining the basis for his recommendation or her recommendation. In our experience, it's not onerous. In our experience, a supervisor should have basic knowledge of Graham versus Connor, at least sufficient to be able to understand whether or not the officer's use of force, whether the threat was sufficient to cause the force, to justify the force. That's not really rocket science in our experience, nor should it be. And we think first level supervisors, that should be one of their responsibilities. Look, fortunately, the Madison Police Department does not use force that frequently. So this isn't going to be something like a sergeant's going to have to make a decision on whether or not a force incident was in policy 4 or 5 times a shift. That's not what's going on here. And what we do not think that we understand there is some benefit and consistency to have the use of force coordinator do that. But if you only have that one level, I think that would overburden the use of force coordinator, where he would have to do a short analysis for every use of force incident within the police department. And I think that burden and responsibility should be shared at first blush by the supervisor in the field, with Sergeant 2 having the opportunity and ability, as Matthew indicated, to override a decision that is not based on fact, or kick it back to the sergeant to say, hey, there's no analysis here that explains why you think the force was in policy. You need to work a little harder, and that will improve the performance of that sergeant on a forward-going basis. So it really was, of all the things we looked at, is one of the most shocking deficits we saw MPD have compared to other agencies its size throughout the country.
Mr. Giannaco, I had a question. This is Mary.
Yeah.
Just a question. With the use of force reporting, with the, where it's the stuff that's going into the database, where the sergeant does that review that with the officer at the scene, did you find that that document, and that kind of satisfies what you were looking for with this item, or no? Is that, I'm kind of hearing no, but.
Yeah, no. And so but the analysis, to go back to the initial question, the analysis in most cases is going to be 2 sentences, if that.
Okay.
You know, the sergeant recommends that the force used by Officer Anderson was in policy because he needed to use a control hold or a takedown in order to overcome the raised fist that was placed in his direction or the swing that was taken by the suspect at him. End of story. We're not talking about War and Peace here.
Okay, thank you for that.
One more, Luis.
Hey, Mike, this is Luis. I hope you're enjoying California weather, but it's very nice here as well. So I don't think that there's any philosophical disagreement here in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. For me, it's always simply balancing your recommendations with taking away from something else. And as you and I had spoken before, one of the concerns that I have always had, is that street supervisors often are that missing link that we have. The commanders, everything on from the chief on down, the captain, lieutenant, that talk about philosophical statements and so forth. But unless you have somebody that ensures that those things are being done at the street level, we're really missing the boat. And I think that those statements are meaningless. So I'm trying to balance what you are suggesting without creating anything else, any additional work for the sergeants that is going to take them away from what we want them to do, and that is to reinforce those positive practices in the streets, monitoring the officers' work, coaching them, training them, ensuring that things are being done by policy. And also, as you know, Sergeant 2 is really in an ideal position to be able to read all the reports, because he's not out on the street. A field supervisor may not be able to see that report for several days until after the incident has occurred. So I think that they are going to have a different perspective. So once again, not opposed to what you're suggesting. I'm just not sure that, and maybe you know how it's done in other cities, but I'm just concerned about creating some additional burden that would take away from that important and critical work that we agree that the supervisors should be doing out on the street.
I agree with you, Luis. The supervisors have a lot to do, but force in America, and one of the reasons we're having this discussion is because force is the third rail in policing right now. It is an awesome responsibility that we give our officers authority to use, and I view it just needs to be very carefully reviewed, and and if that means shuffling away some other responsibilities or increasing some resources here and there, I get it. But force is key here, and I think a community is really interested in ensuring that whenever force is used, that it's carefully and thoroughly vetted and documented.
Thank you.
Okay, Jerry.
Yeah, I just, listening to all the information that's being provided to me, it actually makes a lot of sense, Mike, why this is here. I'm starting to see that from the top down. You have people who are on top, such as Sergeant here, who understands, the policy, who understands the Constitution, right, who understands that test that has to be evaluated. But this is actually really great, because if you require a field supervisor to provide this report, it actually lets you know if they actually know that standard or not. And if they don't, you cannot just necessarily catch the officer who is part of the incident. You can say, hey, his field supervisor doesn't actually even know this. This is a good red flag for myself. I can go and I can actually train this gentleman because maybe it's not being enforced correctly. Maybe this is a good catch for me so that I can check my field supervisors to make sure that they understand and they are doing the correct thing. And it actually makes a lot of sense when I was just listening to you guys explaining it, but that's how I'm reading it. Mike, I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I just thought I'd share that perspective.
Sergeant Toole.
Just a quick clarification. So your point is well taken, and a lot of these things we do already informally. So again, where we have incidents that, again, are not necessarily a violation of the training, the policy, or the standard, if we find issues, and kind of they're already pointed out, where we have made an opportunity for de-escalation, we had an opportunity to review some of the other things that led up to, and just even like tactics in general, I think that's in an upcoming recommendation, are those things that we can do a debriefing, make it a teaching, coaching, mentoring type process for both the officers and the sergeants. Again, while not necessarily formalized and codified, we do that already. Officers and supervisors alike have come to me, reached out and said, hey, can we come and talk about this incident? We've sent you the information through the database, but we have some other questions and we would like to kind of break it down and talk about it. So that also does occur, to your point, that we don't formalize that process. Again, I don't know that we disagree, but it is kind of in some ways the scope. And I absolutely recognize, and I think it's everything you said is valid, everything that Matthew's saying valid in terms of like, yeah, more of that frontline supervision, the better trained, the more involved they are, the better they can know these things are all good things. I think we absolutely want to aspire to that, but as Luis mentioned though, if we talk about, again, even just instances of recordable force where the sergeant now has to dedicate time, resources to do this analysis, that's time they're not necessarily supervising other officers' incidents. And again, from a staffing standpoint, that's, I think, some of the other concern is, and it's to Mr. Janako's point, if we had the resources where we could supervise maybe at a different ratio than what it currently have, it might be more tenable. But again, I think in principle, we are in alignment, but I just think, again, we want to make sure that it's a balance of getting the best product, getting the best analysis, and follow-up for any of these one incidents. Does that make sense, or?
You know, I see where you're coming from. I just think that there's so much more value into the points that Matt has mentioned, and I mean, I think everything I've heard, I just feel like it outweighs what you're bringing up. I'm not saying to devalue it. I think there is value in that as well too. It's just when you weigh kind of the situation why we're here, and like Mike mentioned, and not even Mike, everyone has mentioned that this is such like one of the top items that's being talked nationally. I feel like this little requirement here might create some work, but it will create some value. And here's the thing, you never know. This might actually solve problems that you may not have actually even thought about are currently existing that might actually save you time elsewhere. That's something that we never talk about. We talk about putting the time into and resources into this, word, but it might actually create time somewhere else. And that might actually cause some sort of balance where maybe it might make more sense to move in this direction. Something to think about.
On that note, that sounds pretty good. That's a good way to end it. Thank you, Jerry. So, those in favor of adopting recommendation number 80, please say aye. Aye. Those that oppose?
Aye.
You with us, Greg? Abstain?
It takes 2 seconds to put mute.
Motion carries. Thank you. So as we look at our list, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like there are a few more that's on page 15 that MPD pretty much agrees to. So is there a motion on the floor to adopt recommendation 81, 83, 84, and 85?
I'd like to make a recommendation to adopt, like we did previously. I was going to actually just about ask this question. All the green ones. like we did before with half it. So the rest of the green ones that we haven't adopted yet because they weren't on there, I'd like to make a motion to adopt all of those.
I second it.
Okay, it's been quadruple second. Okay.
So just to be clear, I think that means what we're talking about is 81, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, and 100.
Yes.
Yes, that would be correct.
Didn't say 82.
No.
No, oh, just the green ones.
Yeah, just the green ones. Yeah.
Any further discussion? Those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Abstain? Motion carries. Thank you.
Tom, I don't know how long you want to keep going tonight. I'm going to have to leave fairly soon, and I would like to be able to be part of the discussion about item 3. So I just throw that out there.
Just to note, we have 21 recommendations left of dispute. What's that?
We can take.
Should we do 82?
I think we're going to take item
We're gonna
3 on the
go
agenda
ahead and
out of
vote.
order.
Okay, so Keith.
All right, and we do have, Keith, we do have Dr. G, who will be speaking with a public comment before we address item number 3.
Okay.
Hello, this makes a lot of sense. There's just one thing I thought I'd mention. She would express some concern at the CCDC meeting about reducing quorum. And the thought occurred to me, but I'm almost hesitant to mention this.
Excuse me, is it possible to put a microphone closer?
Not really, no.
Okay.
Maybe I should go up there, or? So this makes a lot of sense. And just one thing I thought I'd mention, though I'm a little bit, even hesitant to mention this. At CECC, Shiva brought up concern about reducing quorum. And, Keith brought up the very valid point that it doesn't make sense to have, new members, because it was suggested perhaps new members could be added. It doesn't make sense to have new members added because, they wouldn't be up to speed with everything. And I'm not advocating this, but I just thought I'd mention there is one person around who represents a community group who wouldn't have to be caught up to speed, but they may be considered far too opinionated. And the other thing I wanted to mention, Denise DeMarb has been tracking this process pretty well. She's now retired as an auditor. I don't know if she'd be interested, but that was just another thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Veronica?
I'd say that at this point, that we are really requesting input from the community, and that we want that input, that we do not reduce the size of this committee, but rather appoint people who have followed this process, like you, like Amelia, like Demar, like Ms. Fallen, that has followed this process. I think that reducing at this point will not be a good thing for what we're trying to do. And I think there's people out that have come constantly and they have provided input to our group that could be very valuable sitting on the table as well. That is my suggestion, not reducing.
I'll add this one. Sorry, this one I will. Keith, do you want to speak or should I go? Can you hear me?
Keith?
No, I couldn't hear Veronica, and I really am barely here now.
Hang on one second, Keith. Hold on.
Can someone, I'm sorry.
Veronica's gonna move to a different mic and repeat it, Keith.
Oh, I don't want to make her repeat the whole thing, but.
Well,
So I'm just saying that reducing our group at this time would not be beneficial, as we are really in a crucial time of our review and wanting the community to have more input. And there's people out in the community that has followed this process to the teeth, like we have, that could be beneficial to be sitting on this table as well. So I will not recommend that we reduce our committee, but rather find a couple more people from those who have followed the process who are willing to join the group.
If I can just report real briefly on what happened at the council executive meeting. Tom and I made the request that the committee, that the council reduce our number from 15 to 13 because we'd had trouble reaching quorum on at least one occasion. We were concerned with meeting twice a month. Over the summer especially, we would have difficulty and that would slow us down. And certainly one alternative is to replace the members who have resigned. Our concern was, as Dr. Glenbeck mentioned, was that it would be very hard for somebody to step in now, not having been through all that we have been through. Now, that having been said, it is probably true that there are some people who are knowledgeable enough to do that. Also, I should say that our view was that our committee is functioning pretty well with the group it has, and that it is quite diverse as is and represents many segments of the community. And so it was working well. I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of replacing the people who've resigned with others who can step in and do the task. The problem is we don't make the appointments. So that's sort of beyond our control as to if we were to keep the committee at 15, who would they be, and would they really be able to sort of share the experience that we've had? I don't know. It seemed more expedient to just keep moving and reducing the number to 13 just meant that we could proceed even if we had 7 members present instead of requiring 8.
Thanks, Keith. Alder Shiba.
Thank you. I just wanted, this is Alder Shiba Bidar. I just wanted to speak to this. One, from a procedural perspective, your recommendation back to the council should be either to recommend that we do reduce the size, or if you don't want us to reduce the size, you could recommend for us to place it on file. So those would be the motion that you could make. If you decide that one option I heard is to not reduce it, but make an additional recommendation, which would be there are 4 members of the public that were mentioned that you would kindly ask the mayor to consider as his appointments to the committee. You can make that language as part of your motion to place on file with additional recommendation that the mayor considered appointing and name the members or whatever you want to do. So that's the procedural thing that I wanted to put out there. I am now going to speak to the issue itself. I would urge you actually to not reduce the size of your committee. The reason I urge you to not do that is because, one, I know you have had issues one time making quorum, but I have to tell you, you have a stellar record as a city committee. It really shows the level of commitment that you all have to this issue and how you want to see really this work come to its final stage of coming to the council. So if I'm going to be looking at committees who haven't made quorum, you would be the example that I would use of real great commitment, especially for a large committee of your size. So it hasn't been an issue. You have but once in the recent past. 2, I like to think about the fact that 8 people actually, so forget the total number was 15 or 13. The reality is your quorum right now is 8 people. I think having 8 people at the table to deliberate this kind of important information and recommendation it's really a minimum number of people we should have at the table. And so further reducing it to now say 7, I just think the more you kind of start having less people, the less voices you're gonna have. And even one additional voice at the table, around this table, just think about like one less of you being here. Every one of you tonight are providing really great perspective. So I would, I know it makes it sound easier, you may lose quorum once in a while, but given your record, your commitment to this issue, I would just urge you not to reduce the size. And I do actually agree that there are members of the public who have followed this issue very, very closely. And yes, you do not have control over what the mayor decides to recommend as appointment to the council, but you can certainly, as a committee, make a recommendation of people that you feel would be able to just join you and have the knowledge. I would lastly say that it is correct that Alder DeMarb, although she hasn't been part of many of your meetings, is one of the alders that followed very closely our work. We do watch the delayed videos in our free time as we are sitting in bed, not having anything else to do after another meeting that we attended live. So, and so because she's not a member of the public, she could potentially be indeed appointed to this committee. So I think you have several options outside the reduction of the number of members of this committee. So,
Before you go, Alder Sheba, what kind of time frame are we talking about? So if we make this initial recommendation, or recommendations plural, how long would it take before the mayor would probably put a stamp of approval on it?
So I cannot speak for the mayor, but I can tell you that from a ability to do it, it can be done in one single council meeting. The mayor can, at the next council meeting, under suspension of rules, ask us to adopt 2 new names to be appointed to this committee. So there is a way to do it as quickly as possible. I don't mean to mix you in other issues, but I will mention on record that this issue came actually, this exact resolution came before the council. I think it was almost, it's not been 60 days, so it was probably about 45 days ago, and it hadn't been referred to this committee. It was just presented with the mayor as the sponsor. It came to council. I asked the council to vote it down, one, because I didn't have a recommendation from this committee, so I didn't feel comfortable that we should take action. And at that time, I said, at the next meeting, we could have an appointment of 2 people and adopt it. 3 at least council meetings have gone since. And so, again, if there is a will to appoint, an appointment can be made immediately. I cannot speak of whether that's going to happen or not. I can tell you that I will take this message back to council leadership and ask council leadership to discuss it with the mayor during their weekly meeting, and say that the will of the, if that is your will, is to appoint 2 people, and that we would urge the mayor to do it as quickly as possible. That's as much leverage I think that I have as a council member. But again, I would say back to my original point, even if it ends up being that there is not an additional 2 appointments, I do think you need 8 people here at minimum out of even 13. So even though it's a quorum issue, I think 8 people is a good number to have.
So we're talking about at least two people appointed?
It's 2 people that you would have, that you're short of your
Okay.
maximum strength.
Okay.
Thank you, Alder Sheeler. I'd like to hear from the remaining committee members on this. This is important for us moving forward, so I'd like to hear from the remaining committee members on their thoughts on this.
I think, you know, I agree, I think wholeheartedly with our alder here. I think if we're talking about reducing the quorum to 6, you know, we're putting functionality over what we've prized about ourselves is you know, being as thorough and as in-depth as possible, and trying to do the best we can. And I think 6 kind of starts pushing that line of hurting our product. And I think where kind of what I feel of where we are as a committee right now is one that is very committed to, you know, making sure that we not just get it done right, but get it done on time. So if as we're looking at doing 2 or more meetings a month, and making sure this gets done. So I don't think quorum will be a problem, and I think even if it is, we'll be able to find a meeting quickly after one that might not make quorum. And with that, I also do agree that there have been some engaged community members as well as a now civilian that can engage in this process without really missing a beat. And so I'm in agreement, and I think we should put forward some names, and regardless, keep quorum as is.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. And I agree. I mean, I think the more voices at this table, that's, I think, why we amended the rules. The better, and she was absolutely right. We are kind of rock stars as city committees go in terms of quorum. I serve on a couple others that haven't met in quite a while for that reason, so we're kind of an anomaly. So I think as long as we have a pretty committed group of 8 to 9 people who are here, out of, even if we don't get the additional 2 people on there, I think we should continue. And I think I agree with Matthew. I think we should put a couple names forward. They might not be appointed, but I think it's certainly worth putting some names forward.
I agree as well. I was just thinking, Alder, is it just easier to just provide and recommend 2 names versus more than 2 names, just for simplicity's sake, or?
So here's what you don't have to. I guess your main the motion really before you is whether you want, like the actual action is whether you want to approve recommendation or recommend approval of what's before you, which is reducing the size, or not, which would be placed on file. And then I would say personally that I'm just thinking through that you could then in your deliberation direct your chairs to send an email to the mayor saying, the committee discussed 4 names that we thought would be good. So that, so it's not, because that way it keeps the motion clear. Your motion is whether up or down on the resolution that's before you. And then your deliberation has been already about, hey, there are some people that maybe, I think, and to answer your question, in that, I think the more name you send, the better the chances are that 2 out of those, whatever. And again, that's just the chairs could send an email to the mayor saying the committee wanted us to let you know that we recommended placing on file. And we also thought that there were 4 people who have followed closely and would be able to step in without an issue. So you could do it that way, if that makes sense.
Just to further clarify what the timing purpose is, in order to be on the Common Council agenda for the next meeting, the mayor would have to make his recommendations by next Wednesday at the latest.
And I didn't mean to say by next meeting. I meant to say in one meeting it could happen. So yes, he could. But I am here to also tell you that can happen.
No, it can't happen. It definitely can't happen. But at the same time, if you wanted to take some more time to deliberate, you guys have another meeting scheduled in July. You could further deliberate who you may want to recommend at that meeting at that time.
And again, all you are doing is recommending. That doesn't, in any way, is not, the mayor does not have to follow any of that, because it's not even an official action. It's just part of more of your discussion.
Okay, Mario? I say we submit more than 2 names.
I think this topic is too important to go down in numbers, and that there are other people who really could contribute a lot, contribute 4 names.
I mean, I talked to Rachel earlier this week to just see how many we missed. I think we only missed 3 meetings the whole time. And then I think the last one was we had quorum in the beginning, and then quorum broke like halfway through. So I mean, that seems like a great record. I'll go based on what the committee thinks. I think that maybe we should just pick our 2, the top 2 that we just really sort of think would mesh with our group. That, I can think of 2 names right away that have definitely followed the committee, either as a legislator, which obviously Demise is, like Matt said, a civilian now, and other folks as well. But I also think that, we could definitely lean in on Gloria too and say, hey, go back to the mayor and say, hey, can we get this done by next Wednesday? So that way it'll be before the council for the next meeting. So that'd be my suggestion as well.
I think we have one more, Luis.
Yeah,
Then we'll go to Keith.
I agree. We've been just right borderline so many times of being able to make quorum or not. I really don't want us to see any lower, because I do value the fact that we need a good number of people to have these critical discussions that are going to impact our community in terms of the recommendations that we make. I wouldn't rush to come up with two names. I think that there are probably several people that might be interested. I think that for me, I like Dr. Gellenbeck. He's almost like a part of our committee because he's been here at every meeting. But I think that there are others as well who have been here, so perhaps have not been as vocal, who might be interested in participating. I do value Demar because she has the background, she has a context in terms of city policies, and also has followed this committee. She was, I think, her and Shiva, or it's probably safe to say, one of the two that helped to forge this path for the committee. So I think I would like to see her considered, but I don't think that we need to rush into coming up with names at this point. Simply make a decision as to what we want to do.
And I don't, one thing I don't want to have you do is like become like on the side, have to come up even with the names. Like, you have a lot going on. So I don't want you to be, to have to like deal with that. I do think it's important for you. The decision again before you is we want to reduce the size, we don't want to reduce the size. And then if you have some recommendations of names, great. And over time, if you have more, great. But like that, I feel is like almost like very much secondary because, it can become, now you're like, take it upon yourself to have to search for names. And I mean, you have a lot. So I don't feel like you're also, if you say no, you don't want to reduce your size, that you have to take responsibility for who these additional two could be. I can even say that I can relate to my colleagues that your conversations were these 4 names and potentially additional names, and that, these names were mentioned, and that could be that, right? I mean, so again, don't feel like you have to take responsibility for seeing through the additional names.
Thank you, Alder Shiva. So it sounds like we need to make a motion. So before we do that, Keith, do you have any last words?
No, I don't really have strong feelings about it one way or the other, so I'm fine with the consensus of the group.
Okay, so
I guess I'm wondering, so
we're going to make a
do
motion.
we need a motion?
Yeah,
The motion would be
Deciding to do anything?
the motion would be to place on file.
Okay.
So do we have a motion?
I make a motion to
Okay. Place
this item on file.
Okay. Any further discussion? Those in favor say aye. Oppose? Abstain? All right, motion carries.
Before I move to adjourn, I wanted to say my second name was Dr. Z as well. He's been influential on almost every aspect of our committee, so thank you for your help.
Do we want to set future meeting dates though before we finish our agenda before we adjourn?
Yeah, we have one more agenda item we need to discuss, and that's for future meetings. So Rachel, if you could tell us what your doodle results were?
Well, the doodle results unfortunately are going to be inconclusive in such that I didn't get a majority of the committee members to respond to the doodle for beyond the rest of this. So I think we have a majority of the committee members here. So I think the biggest question going forward was first and third or second and fourth I think Thursdays were pretty much the consensus of the committee, but whether or not first and third or second and fourth works better.
Well, let's take a vote on it, because I would be second and fourth.
And we could just raise a hand, show of hands, whatever. First and third?
What do you say?
First and third Thursdays. First and third Thursdays. Who would vote for first and third Thursdays?
Like we were doing before.
Well, and you can vote for, put your hands up if you're available, I guess, is what I'm saying. First and third. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, okay. Second and fourth? I think that the second and fourth wins, but I think it was pretty slim.
What wins, second and fourth?
If we did first and third, will we be meeting next Thursday, or?
Well, I think we're already, no, this is going beyond July. We're already planning on meeting the 26th is our next meeting.
I'd like to ask for everyone, to just double check your schedules, and maybe I would like to ask for a commitment from everyone here to get back to Rachel by tomorrow. And because that gives you a little bit more time to go home and investigate your personal calendars and check out your work obligations and responsibilities. So I would ask that we could have everyone's word here that we would respond to Rachel tomorrow.
So the third Thursday is my board meeting, so
Sure. I think if you just shoot me an email saying your availability for either the first and third or the second and fourth. If both work for you, I have no problems, then just tell me that, and then we can have a good indication. Once I have a response from everybody, I'll just send an email out to everybody letting you know where we stand. The sooner we can have the meeting scheduled, the easier it is for me to reserve meeting rooms, which is kind of why we're in this meeting room, because there are not a lot of meeting rooms that are available in the city that can accommodate a group of this size, as well as City Channel and well as the public. So it becomes fairly difficult to schedule when I don't know that far in advance when we're actually going to be meeting.
Again, our next meeting is the 26th.
Our next meeting is the 26th. I think, unfortunately, now location's still TBD because I originally said water utility, but there may be an existing conflict there. So I will let everybody know where that meeting is going to be at.
And I won't be at that meeting.
All right, well then maybe I'll also, if you can include in your email to me tomorrow, your availability for the meeting on the 26th, so that we know if we're going to have quorum or not.
Yeah, we can go from there.
If you need one person to make quorum.
Okay. So yeah, tomorrow, just, if you can, let me know your availability for the 26th to make sure we have quorum, and whether or not first and third or second and fourth Thursdays in August work the best for you. Or I should say your availability, not even say work the best. I'm not going to give you that much latitude.
Is everyone okay with that? Okay, I think.
No, one last word. I just want to know that
Louis?
when Christian and I were chairs, that we had planned on buying dinner for everybody during the summer months. There's some motivation to bring people here. So,
Does that include steak?
Findley, are you hearing this?
Wait, y'all did that?
Well, we're planning.
I don't know.
You had intentions.
Matthew woke up on that. All right. So we had a motion to adjourn. Is that correct? Second? Any further discussion? Those in favor? Opposed? Meeting adjourned.